Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Political Behavior. Today, we're going to be discussing campaigns. A couple quick notes before we get going. The deadline to drop the course with a W is this Friday, the 27th by 5 p.m., but please do contact me before then in order to discuss this if you are indeed considering dropping the course. As I said, today we're talking about campaigns. Your readings for this week discuss some of the modern developments surrounding campaigns. Garrett discusses the changes surrounding finance and how this is affecting the influence that pressure groups are having on the political process. Bonnier examines how campaigns are using social media to micro-target voters, while Ganius, published a couple decades ago now, looks at the broader changes wrought by social media platforms themselves. Now, generally, when we're talking about campaigns, we're talking about the time between the primary and the general elections. The modern political environment stretches this a little bit past the primary, but let's think about this solely as candidates that have advanced past the primary stage. Now, as we discussed last week, by winning the primary election, the candidate has successfully staked out a set of positions, gathered their core supporters, and hopefully not entirely alienated the rest of the partisan base that voted for their primary opponent or primary opponents. That's the starting position, but this is insufficient to win the general election come November. In between the primary and the general, they need to capture the support of a majority or at least a plurality of November voters. Now, the main activities within a campaign can be broken down into a couple categories which interact with one another. The first and potentially most important of these is advertising. Now, advertising can be used to attack opponents, can be used to communicate a policy priority, but the most important function of advertising is to increase name recognition. If a voter walks into the polling booth in November in order to cast a ballot, they are much more likely to vote for a name that is familiar over one that is unknown. This is a key function of advertising and is one of the reasons why so much money is spent on television, on radio, on social media ads. Even if you are annoyed by the ad, even if you don't pay attention to the specific content of that ad, even if you don't retain any of the specifics, your subconscious is being trained that that name in that advertisement is more and more familiar. Now, depending on the election, there may be a concerted effort to communicate a partisan identity of that candidate. Even in nonpartisan elections, the signage for a candidate will use blue or red dominated schemes in order to signal their association or identification with that party. The ways that individual candidates and individual advertisements do this can be relatively subtle, but the key point here is to increase familiarity and associate that name with one or the other major parties. Now, advertising can also emphasize similarity with the recipient, a core aspect of micro-targeting, as discussed by Bonnier. Advertisements can also highlight endorsements from well-known and well-considered politicians, as well as discuss policy priorities. The digital age itself has brought in changes with social media. These are discussed by Ganius, as well as the rise of digital newsletters and other forms of non-traditional advertising here. Now, this leads into the second activity, position taking, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous weeks. Fundamentally, successful campaigns use data to identify the important issues, attributes, and policies to the constituencies likely to vote in a given elections. Fundamentally, campaigns are trying to identify a winning coalition of the electorate and mobilize that coalition to a greater extent than their opponents. One candidate may emphasize a law and order deregulation and low tax platform, while their opponent will promise healthcare reform, increase education funding, and an end to mass incarceration. They will stake positions that divide the electorate in a way that they perceive will give them an advantage, or to put it another way, take positions that most people will agree with. Now, there will necessarily be some degree of overlap on issues that people care about, as illustrated on the screen now. Campaigns will attempt to be more persuasive to voters that might go either way, those proverbial swing voters. And this can be the result of candidate charisma, effective rhetoric, or some other factor. Now, the public's desires are sometimes malleable, sometimes changeable, and sometimes not. If gas costs $10 a gallon, every candidate on the ballot will at minimum give lip service to the cost of living crisis, or better yet, give evidence that they are uniquely qualified to solve this crisis, have experience with solving similar crises, or at minimum have a plan to address this key issue. But most of the time, in most elections, there's not going to be a single issue that dominates the campaign. As we've discussed multiple times with the concept of issue ownerships, campaigns will focus on issue areas where they feel as though they have an advantage. And by focusing on that topic, campaigns can affect what issues the public cares about and therefore what issues the electorate will be deciding upon. The third key activity of campaigns is to build what we call a mobilization network. This very often takes the form of paid and volunteer workers going door to door knock and or canvass potential voters. Fundamentally, you want to ensure that people know how to vote, that they are registered to vote, and that they can get to the polling place on election day. You also want to try and convince those who have not yet decided whom to vote for, and you want to create a sense of enthusiasm and excitement for the candidate. This can be contagious. It can create what we call a bandwagon effect, whereas if the person who's relatively undecided and unknown sees people excited about a candidate, excited about that election, they're more likely to throw their support behind that candidate. Now, part of mobilization that ties into both advertising and position taking nowadays is performing some of these functions via social media. As discussed by Bonnier, micro-targeting can actually perform some of these functions if done correctly. Showing images of people similar to the recipient, excited about a candidate, supporting the issues identified as important to that recipient, can actually emulate the effects of door-to-door campaigning, emulate the effects of that kind of canvassing, and perhaps even exceed its effects, and specifically exceed its effect in terms of cost effectiveness. Now, how they go about this specifically depends on a wide variety of factors, but one of the key points of separation in strategy is the type of candidate: incumbents, challengers, and newcomers. Incumbents, generally speaking, are going to emphasize the positive parts of their record, their experience. They're going to display photos of them with more well-known politicians, as well as other similar approaches. Incumbents usually generally defend their previous performance, which you might think would put them at a disadvantage. But the idiom, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, really does some of the heavy lifting here. Fundamentally, incumbents represent the status quo. They are known quantities. And many voters are very much unwilling to upend the status quo without significant cause. Many offices also offer significant advantages for incumbents, be that franking or the use of the Postal Service to disseminate campaign materials for free, as well as other similar factors. Challengers, on the other hand, are going to necessarily attack the incumbent's record, highlighting missteps, bad statements, or scandals, and frame their challenge as better suited to the needs of the constituency. Challengers need to make the affirmative case. They are fighting against the status quo. They're oftentimes going to be less well known, less experienced, and less well funded. These are some of the reasons why incumbent legislators are more vulnerable at the primary stage, not actually at the general stage, and why we see a tremendously high re-election rate for incumbent legislators, at least at the federal level. Alternatively, the newcomer type of candidates, and here we're discussing elections where there is no incumbent, elections around an open seat otherwise. Now, these will generally attack the suitability of their opponent, emphasizing their relevant experience, and attempting to frame the campaign in a manner that gives them an advantage. In many ways, these kind of newcomer or open seat elections, they're kind of the most open-ended here. And a lot of these campaigns are focused first and foremost on name recognition and party association. And any kind of specific position taking or mobilization efforts are very much a secondary concern. Now, throughout this entire discussion, the unstated and perhaps most important aspect of campaigns is money. This is why for this week, Garrett is the required reading. Each of the previously discussed activities requires money, and the amounts in order to do this have been steadily increasing election to election year on year. Candidates are constantly attempting to fundraise so that they can afford campaign experts, advertisements, grassroots organizers, and so on. Campaigns today are highly professional, highly funded affairs where the candidate is only the front facing avatar of a highly complex organization and machine. And this is even true at the state level and even in some major local elections in major metropolitan areas. Think San Francisco, think Los Angeles, think New York City. Now, money funds all of this. The world of campaign finance laws is highly complex, requiring dedicated professionals in order to meaningfully navigate. Now, as discussed by Garrett, after the Citizens United decision, candidates now need to attract funding from super PACs, political action committees. These PACs are nominally or in name outside organizations that individuals are largely free to contribute to. Super PACs can then, independent of the politicians and independent of the campaigns, advocate for candidates or parties through advertising as well as some other means. There are opportunities for the organizations to sums to the parties, and then for the parties to distribute these funds to the individual campaigns themselves. This doesn't mean that this is the Wild West, that wealthy donors can influence politicians without oversight. Disclosure requirements exist, and 501c organizations, C3, C4, C5s, and so on, are limited in what they can do. But the net effect of the Citizens United decision was to create a far more permissive environment in terms of funding, if not disclosure. When people complain that there is too much money in politics, this is generally the situation that they're referring to. However, for the campaigns themselves, they must play this game or they will lose to campaigns that do. And as a result, candidates must be aware of the desires of the big money in politics, those big donors, those large super PACs. If they don't support a key priority of these groups, they're very unlikely to attract funds in service of their campaign and potentially be less likely to win their specific election as a result. So to close out today, the third response paper, which is due this Sunday by 11:59 p.m., asks you to consider these developments in light of the previous discussion of pressure groups. Fundamentally, is influence in these campaigns balancing influence? Are constituents, voters, still the decisive factor? Or is this new world of campaigns something altogether different than what Nouns and Milbrath were writing about? So that's all I have for you this week. A reminder that the peer reviews for this week are still due this Friday. As always, feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns, and otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week.